We may have cornered the market as far as organized crime. We certainly cornered the headlines. We certainly made the biggest news, but we weren't the only mobsters at the time. There were a lot of other guys that did some damage back then. Hey everyone, welcome to another Sit Down with Michael Franzese. Hope everybody is doing well. All is very good and blessed on this end, and as always, I give God all the praise, honor, and glory for that, and I really mean that. You know, anytime you think of a gangster, a mobster, what do you think of? You think of Mafia, you think of Cosa Nostra, you think of John Gotti, think of Al Capone, all the famous names, infamous names that I can mention. You always associate gangster, a mobster, with the Mafia, with Cosa Nostra in this country. Why? Obvious. We capture all the attention all the time. I don't think anybody had more media attention than John Gotti in our recent years, in our era. Of course, Al Capone, Lucky Luciano, even Meyer Lansky. All these guys got so much media attention and press. And you don't hear that from, people that were not of Italian descent. Now, of course, you had some that were well known. Obviously, Clyde Barrow, from Bonnie and Clyde, John Dillinger, Dutch Schultz, Whitey Bulger, people like that. Yeah, okay, they were notorious and you knew about them. But there were a lot of other guys that were not Italian that certainly made their mark. And you can call them gangsters and mobsters mainly because of what they got involved in, whether it would be bootlegging, gambling in some way, narcotics in some way. So they were gangsters. So I'm going to name a couple of them you probably never heard of, maybe one or two, probably never heard of, but just want to get my point across. The Italian Mafia, Cosa Nostra, my former, group, we don't carry the market on all of organized crime. Just want you to know that. So I'm going to go, they're not necessarily in any order, but I think you might find this interesting. First guy was a guy by the name of Shondor Birns, and he was born in Czechoslovakia in 1907. His family settled in Cleveland, Ohio. Very interestingly, his mom had an illegal alcohol still. She was a bootlegger, basically, and she got blown up. The still blew up. I don't know if it was purposely or by accident, whatever, but her still blew up and she blew up in it. And then from 1930s to 1975, this guy, Shondor, he was pretty well known in Cleveland. He was investigated several times. He was a bootlegger. He was into narcotics, I understand, and into some gambling operation. And he operated out of Cleveland, very heavily investigated. So he was pretty notorious back then. And then finally, he was murdered in 1975, a car bomb in his Lincoln Continental, and allegedly it was done by the Hells Angels. Must have got into an argument with them. Who knows? The wrong side. Maybe it was over a drug deal. I'm just speculating. I don't know. But that was Shondor Birns from Czechoslovakia. Next, we have somebody you probably do know, Mickey Featherstone. Now, Mickey was an Irish guy, and he was part of the Westies group. And he was a pretty tough guy. He allegedly became a contract killer. He was under Jimmy Coonan, who was a good friend of mine. Jimmy's now doing a lot of time in prison. And when the Westies started to work with Fat Tony, they did start to work with the Genovese family. Fat Tony had pretty much involvement with them. When they started to work with them, he didn't like that for some reason. He wanted to stay within the Irish group, and he resented heavily Jimmy Coonan getting involved with Fat Tony. And my dad knew Jimmy Coonan pretty well, too. They did time together. He was a good guy. He really was. Very, very tough guy. And so they had a falling out, Featherstone and Coonan did. And he became an informant, Featherstone did, I think in 1987. I remember it back then. He testified against Jimmy in a case, put him away for life, and a bunch of the other Westies also. So that was Mickey Featherstone. Some of you may know him. He was pretty highly publicized back in the day. Another guy by the name of Casper Holstein, and he was an African-American. He lived and worked in Harlem from the 1920s on. And there was actually a character in Boardwalk Empire, I think his name was Valentine Narcissa, something like that, and he was actually inspired by Casper in real life. And he lived very, very large. He made his money through illegal gambling. He was a huge figure in Harlem back at that time. I think he spent about a year in jail for some kind of gambling conviction. And then when he got out of prison, he retired from the criminal life in 1937. So you can retire from criminal life if you're not involved in organized crime, Mafia, Cosa Nostra, like I was. They let you take a pass because he really had nobody to answer to. So that was Casper Holstein, pretty big guy in his time. Another guy, Murray the Camel Humphreys. His family immigrated from Wales in the late 1800s. Wales, okay? You wouldn't think that. But he ended up in Chicago. He was into bootlegging. And there was a story that he had hijacked a truck owned by Al Capone. And then they caught him, and he was brought in to see Al Capone. And usually when you had a meeting with Capone, you hijacked one of his trucks, you did something against him, you didn't walk out of the meeting. But in this particular case, he did walk out. Somehow he talked himself out of whatever was going to happen. And Capone made a statement about him later on. He said, "Nobody hustles like the Hump." And he allowed Humphrey to join his group, the Chicago group under Capone. And allegedly, he was the inspiration for the Tom Hagen character in Godfather, played by Robert Duvall. Brilliantly, I might add. So that was Murray the Camel Humphreys. Next, we have a guy by the name of Ken Ito, and he was a Japanese immigrant. He was raised in California. He moved to Chicago, again, in 1949. Very big in the numbers business. And he was paying up to the Chicago mob. If you were in Chicago and you operated on the street, you had to pay up to the mob. And of course, it wasn't Capone at that time, it was the other guys that were involved. And then things somehow turned bad for him. The mob tried to kill him. They shot him 3 times in the head, but he lived because, from what I understand, the bullets were homemade and they didn't put enough powder in the bullets to actually kill somebody. So they shot him in the head 3 times. He lived. But he put a bunch of guys in jail at one time. He became an informant. He entered the witness protection program, and then he died in 2004. So that was Ken Ito, Japanese immigrant raised in California. Next, we have somebody by the name of Chelsais Bouras, if I think it is. He's a Greek guy. Hopefully I'm pronouncing it right. He operated in Philadelphia in the 1970s. He had a number of Greek gangsters that worked with him. Greek gangsters, see, it's not only Italians. They were into loan sharking, gambling, and drugs, and they got involved with Nicky Scarfo's crew at one point in time. But at some point, they refused to pay the street tax that Scarfo wanted. He's probably bleeding them a little bit, and they said, no, we're not paying it. And what happened? He was gunned down in a Greek restaurant in 1981. So at that time, it wasn't a good idea not to do what Scarfo wanted you to do. So Chelsais Bouras, a Greek gangster out of Philadelphia. Next, we have a guy by the name of Vojislav Stanimirovic. Vojislav Stanimirovic. And he was a Serbian mobster. And he turned into a journalist later on, believe it or not. But he was famous for his part in a big robbery in 1971 at the Villa Wiseguy in Florida. They stole about $1.5 million worth of art and some silver objects, including a priceless silver bowl that was owned by Napoleon Bonaparte. After he got out of prison, he went to jail for that. He became a journalist, and he wrote about crime, and he now writes for the Washington Post and the Daily Beast. So, you change, careers. He was a gangster, and he became a journalist and a very successful one. So, another story, a Serbian mobster. We're doing the League of Nations here, all different people involved. Next guy on the list was Jose Miguel Battle, and he was a Cuban, and he was actually a patriot for us. He fought for the U.S.-backed Botch invasion at the Bay of Pigs, and he fled back to the U.S. when that fell apart. He forged a huge criminal empire that was built on drugs and gambling, and this was in Florida mostly. He became the leader of a criminal enterprise known as the Corporation, and he amassed allegedly more than $1 billion from these illegal activities. He was arrested in Peru because he was doing some business that dealt all the way into Peru, from Peru into Florida. They caught him in Peru. He was extradited to the United States, and he died in prison in 1977 while he was awaiting a transfer from one prison to another. So that was Jose Miguel Battle, a Cuban. Next, we have a guy by the name of Johnny Ang, and they called him Onion Head. They also called him Machine Gun Johnny. And he was a leader of the gang called the Flying Dragons. They were a street gang in the 1980s in Chinatown area of New York City. And Chinatown is right next to Little Italy back then. I remember this gang. It was kind of publicized back then. I believe, I can't say definitively, but I believe I was an MCC in the federal jail with some of the members of that gang. And he was a brutal guy, brutal gang. You know, those Chinese were pretty rough in there. I remember back in the day. And he was arrested in 1993. He was sentenced to 24 years in prison. He was fined $3.5 million. He was released in 2010. And a year later, his wife was murdered, allegedly by another Flying Dragon member. And he later killed himself. So it was a tough life, man. I'm telling you, the street life people, tough life, something that nobody wants to get involved in. All right, next we have somebody by the name of Charlie Wall. He was nicknamed the Wasp. He also was known as the Dean of the Underworld in Tampa, Florida. Wasn't the usual mobster. He came from a very wealthy family. His father was a doctor. His mother was the daughter of the mayor of Tampa. Somehow he got involved in the street. He was involved in a couple of gang wars. In the first, and he reigned over the illegal gambling in Tampa. That was his deal. I think he was involved in drugs also. But he was very well connected politically, I guess because of his mother being the daughter of the mayor. He got some good relationships there. He got involved in a war in the 1940s in Tampa. And he won that war with some other, rival gang guys that were on the streets at that time. But then he got involved in a second war, mob war, in 1955. He was murdered. And he was beaten to death, I heard brutally, with a bat. His throat was slit. And allegedly, they say that the guy that ordered that was Santo Trafficante. We all know who he was. He was the boss of the Cosa Nostra in Florida. So that's it. You have a list of 10 guys, none of them Italian. They were non-Italians, League of Nations, all different backgrounds and ethnic groups. And they were pretty well-known gangsters in their own day. So you see, we may have cornered the market as far as organized crime. We certainly cornered the headlines. We certainly made the biggest news. But we weren't the only mobsters at the time. There were a lot of other guys that did some damage back then. So that's it for today. And people, if you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe. We're on our way to 1 million. We're getting close. Big giveaway that's going to probably start November 1st. It's going to be a big one, and it's going to lead all the way up till we get 1 million subs. So it'll start November 1st. My team is working on it now. It's going to be a big one, better than we've ever had before, because we got to thank you. I mean, getting to 1 million in 2 years is a pretty big achievement. And of course, we thank all of you for bringing us there. This is my dog, my little sweetheart, Nova. How you doing, baby? Anyway, good girl. You good girl? You want to be on camera too? I got to tell you, Siberian Huskies, they're so beautiful. They're the best dogs, very loyal. And she's actually my daughter's dog, but she's been terrific. Anyway, so that's it. How do I always leave you? The same way. Be safe, people. I don't even want to turn the news on anymore. In New York, my own city, in Los Angeles, cities all over the country. I don't know what's going on here today, but I hope God intervenes and we catch hold of ourselves, what's going on in this country. So be safe. Ladies, especially you. Be healthy. Take care of yourself. It's important. This could be a good life if you get to live it the right way. And part of that, of course, is maintaining your health. Be safe. Be healthy. I mean this sincerely from the bottom of my heart. God bless every one of you. And yes, I'll see you next time.